Critical discourse analysis. As Cindy has said, I am a lecturer in law. I used to be a practicing lawyer before moving into the law school. And my research area is social care, particularly adult social care and legal aspects of adult social care and disability rights. I focus particularly on the devolved context, but not entirely. So my knowledge of social care is in relation to England, Wales and Scotland in particular. And this particular project that I'm going to discuss relates to the Welsh angle. I've been asked to talk about critical discourse analysis and its relevance to my research. And I see that I was billed online as a masterclass, which stressed me out slightly, I have to say, because I am still finding out about critical discourse analysis. I'm still working my way through it. It's one of those research methods or methodologies or research approaches that is, it's complex and complicated, and it's still something I'm very much learning about. And you'll see in the abstract that I wrote for this session that I explicitly said this, you know, I'm going to talk about how I drew on critical discourse analysis to examine a grassroots narrative. And I very consciously used the term drew on critical discourse analysis because concept and ideas of CDA were very much at the base of my project. And were fundamental to the developments of the methods, but doing a CDA is perhaps a slightly different thing again. So let's move the slides on. Is how I felt about critical discourse analysis when I first kind of came across the idea. I've put there as well, you'll notice on the slide, I've put critical discourse analysis and / critical discourse studies. You'll see both these terms used. The term that was initially used pretty much university was critical discourse analysis. Practitioners are now starting to move towards use of the term critical discourse studies. So just to make you aware of that, you'll see both terms in CDA or CDS used, sometimes interchangeably. And I feel that CDA is kind of a method or an approach that's really quite shrouded in mystique. It was very clear when I first came across it that it was relevant to my research. But I couldn't get a handle on it at all, either as a concept or certainly how to do it. And I met loads of other people in a similar position, kind of scholars kind of wandering around saying, you know, I want to do a discourse analysis or a critical discourse analysis, but I don't know how. Where's the manual on DA or CDA? And of course, there is no manual, and I will explain why there is no manual at a later stage. CDA is also very, very bound up with theoretical discussion. And I found that certainly initially, and even now, actually, really intimidating. Partly because I'm not myself a natural theorist. I'm not a natural philosopher thinking that way, thinking in very large abstract terms doesn't come easily to me. And lots of different ideas were flying at me: social constructionism, discursive psychology, post-structural linguistics, and so on. And I felt really kind of lost in this wood. And I felt that I was in this kind of really thick forest with no map and no rivers and no means of finding direction. And it took me a very, very long time to become confident with the essential ideas, and even longer to be confident that I was kind of a fit person to engage with these ideas. But I couldn't pull myself away from it because it was so obviously connected with what I was doing and trying to do. So I'm going to talk about CDA from this perspective, not necessarily as a master, but as a researcher who's really grappled with these ideas, what it is, what CDA is, what it does. And I found certain understandings and principles, and also some things that don't work or I really struggled with. So I'm going to kind of set those out. And I'm going to talk about the project which engaged with the concept of counter-narratives and how this really connected with the ideas that are prevalent in critical discourse analysis. So the project, in a very brief outline. I had become, particularly during my master's, aware of what is often referred to as a philosophy of independent living. And independent living is a concept that's devised or has been devised or was devised by the disabled people's movement. So this was a grassroots idea. It was something that disabled activists created, discussed, generated themselves. That's often misunderstood. People sometimes think independent living is an idea that disabled people can use. It's not, it's a grassroots narrative. And it's prevalent particularly in North America, Western Europe, and so on, where it's been placed at the center of disabled people's campaigning against oppression and discrimination. But it is also a global phenomenon. You see this as an idea being discussed right across the world. Independent living at its base is a straightforward idea. I'm not going to go into it in detail because there isn't time, obviously, but it basically sets out the principle that disabled people should be able to lead the lives of their choice on an equal basis with others. Disabled people should have the same choices over their lives. They should have the same control over their lives. So disabled people should be able to live where they want, with the people of their choice, or alone, if they prefer to live alone. People should be able to have a job that they enjoy, that they feel fulfilled in, that they're good at, a decent education, and the same education and employment opportunities as their peers. People should be able to go out in the evening with the people of their choice, stay out until the time that they want, turn on the television in their own house, invite people round to their own house, exercise self-determination, and do the things that non-disabled people take for granted without interference. Now, as I say, that seems like a really straightforward idea, but this is something that has been consistently denied disabled people, both historically and currently. And independent living, or with independent living, the disabled people's movement has had some really significant policy and successes. So if we just take the UK, because that's where my research focuses on, independent living has been absorbed into policy relating to disabled people and social care for many years now, in England, in Wales, in Scotland, although it's recently become less prevalent in the English context. So we see these huge policy successes, and strategy around disability and disabled people has been based around this concept of independent living for a long time now. We see legal successes. Both the law of social care in both Wales and England explicitly references independent living. So we have these huge policy successes. It's also been incorporated into the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Huge policy successes in the UK and globally. But despite these successes, the current information from the disabled people's movement is that independent living is not just not happening, but it is being increasingly denied. It's on the downturn in practical terms. Now, it's clear that much of this was down to policy and legal implementation, and particularly the lack of funds and the austerity context. The law and policy just wasn't being fully implemented. But it was also clear that something was going on at the policy level, because disabled activists were talking about the co-optation of independent living and the corruption of independent living in policy. So I wanted to get to the bottom of that. What was and is going on with the concept of independent living in policy and law, which enables this corruption to take place? So essentially, I wanted to drill down into the minutiae of that. How were the disabled people's movement constructing independent living, and how were policymakers constructing independent living? And were those constructions the same, or were they different? Now, it's not rocket science that policymakers and grassroots organizations talk about concepts differently. That's kind of pretty much a given. But what I wanted to try to get to understand is, how was that happening? What was going on in this really detailed kind of aspect of it? Now, I had already conceptualized or considered independent living as a counter-narrative. And this idea was really central to my project. By a counter-narrative, I essentially mean a narrative of resistance and identity reconstruction and repair. And I'm going to unravel that a little bit. A counter-narrative basically is a story, it's a narrative that challenges the master narratives that we're surrounded with in society, that tell us how to live, who we are, how we should be behaving. And the concept of master narratives essentially goes back to the theory of cultural hegemony, first propounded by the Marxist thinker Gramsci. And he described how a dominant group is able to set out its own beliefs and its own values in such a way that their authority and their norms become natural. And people buy into those values and norms without realizing they're doing so. So master narratives are all around us. We see them all the time in adverts, in plays, TV programs, fairy tales, books, in academic research, medical literature, historical accounts, and so on. And they delineate acceptable ways that we perform social roles, and they establish acceptable identities for different groups within society and the appropriate forms of behavior from those groups. And these are so much a part of our kind of cultural and social heritage that they just come to form our accepted sense of what's normal or natural or right. And they purport to be neutral. We kind of see them and experience them as neutral ideas, things that we just know. But of course, they're loaded with values, and they typically reflect the values of the dominant social groups. And they attribute kind of values of failure, loss, deficit, and so on to marginalized groups. And there are, of course, a way of bolstering certain views and social approaches. And the purpose of a counter-narrative is to, for an out group or a marginalized group, a group that's been marginalized by the master narratives, to resist those narratives and to resist the identities and the experiences that they ascribe to the marginalized group. It's a means of a marginalized group to create their own identity based on their own values and their own experiences, and a means of demonstrating that there are other ways of being. So that's why I describe them as narratives of resistance and of identity repair. So here what we're seeing on this slide is a kind of a traditional, these were the views of disability that I grew up with. You would see these collection boxes all over the place of very passive people asking for things, asking for assistance. On the right, if you don't know who that is the singer Ian Drury, a punk singer who was himself disabled. So we can see different ways of creating a narrative around disability, master narrative on the left and the counter narrative on the right. For a research structure, that would enable me to look into this and to find out what was going on in the policy situation. And this was where I ran into some difficulties. I found this really hard because there was no kind of off-the-shelf method that I could use. The academic research that looks at counter-narratives, the vast bulk of it looks at the content of the counter-narrative and looks at how marginalized groups reconstruct themselves and use counter-narratives as a means of navigating their lives. And the typical method of discovery, of research, is interviews. That wasn't going to work in my situation. So I needed a structure that would enable me to study independent living as a counter-narrative in different sets of documents. First documents created by the disabled people's movement, and then policy and legal documents, and to compare these different constructions and to consider what was going on underneath what was being written, beyond the obvious of what was being written, particularly in terms of identity and power relations. So I started obviously looking at research methods that would that were relevant to forms of textual analysis. I was very, very clear that I wanted my research method to be rigorous and systematic and transparent and clear and replicable, because I read a lot of reports of projects, a lot of papers and articles and so on, where I didn't feel that the methods were necessarily always very clear and transparent. And I looked at lots of different ideas. I looked at content analysis and whether I could do things with quantitative approaches. And I looked at the concept of Raymond Williams' keywords, and could I explore particular words in different ways and plot their kind of genealogical process. I looked at things like corpus linguistics, and then I came across discourse analysis. And then that took me to critical discourse analysis. And two things happened at this point. Firstly, things started to make sense. My research project really, really started to make sense to me. I felt as if I was kind of in the company of people who were kind of trying to do similar things from what I was trying to do. But also, on the other hand, things started to get really confused. And I started reading about CDA and found it really difficult to get a handle on it. So what is it? What is critical discourse analysis? Well, you cannot talk about discourse in this context without touching at least on the work of this person. This is the French philosopher Michel Foucault. And he did an enormous amount of work, of foundational work on the concept of discourse, which is absolutely fundamental to this work now. Now, I've said that I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a natural philosopher, and I really grappled with the work of Foucault. I have tried to read Foucault. I find it very, very difficult. I find his work very, very difficult to get a handle on. And yet, again, it was clear that he was talking about very similar things. Foucault's concept of discourse relates essentially to groups of kind of experts in society, or maybe I should say self-appointed experts, people who establish themselves as experts in a particular field. Let's take the field of disability again, just for convenience. And together, those experts establish how we talk about that field and the various actors within that field. So these experts establish what are described as discourses within these fields. And these different discourses create the way we then, in broader society, think about a social phenomenon or the groups of people acting within that social phenomenon. And they create social understandings and acceptable ways of thinking about the phenomena and the groups within it. So these understandings, these discourses tell us what a social group is like, as a result, how they should be treated socially, and how we should interact, how we should all interact with each other. How should we interact with disabled people? How should disabled people interact with us, etc., etc. And these discourses then underpin and justify certain power relationships around these groups of people. So, for example, who is entitled to interact with them? What form should that interaction take? So ultimately, these discourses are shaping society itself. Now, if anybody taking part in this workshop today feels they can explain Foucault and his concept of discourses better than I've tried to do there, do feel free to chip in the Q&A, because this work I found this really difficult. But that is the basic concept of discourse as set out by Foucault. So again, we can see the impact of these discourses in society. And this made total sense to me, because in the text that I was reading that had emerged from the disabled people's movement, particularly in the very early days of the disabled people's movement, I was encountering real anger and frustration about exactly this idea, that disabled people were having their lives and their identities shaped by experts, typically medical experts, and typically people setting themselves up as experts through the remit of large charities focusing on in the area of disability, and creating from a position of power, of social power, very specific narratives about how disabled people were to be treated. And those narratives were forcing disabled people both into certain roles and into certain social structures, including institutionalization and essentially incarceration and segregation as a direct result of the discourses that were being propounded about them. So you can see very clearly the link with the concept of counter-narratives and master narratives that I was talking about earlier, and why this made so much sense to me when I encountered this idea. And the purpose of critical discourse analysis is essentially to unpick this. Critical discourse analysis holds that any given discourse constructs the social world in such a way as to infuse certain ideas with this status of common sense and fact, and what I might describe as a master narrative that perpetuates certain ways of thinking. Critical discourse analysis aims to unravel how that is being done, to understand the workings of it and to expose the workings of it. And it's characterized in particular by consideration of what language is doing, the role of language in this process, and how language produces and reproduces power and social inequalities. Kind of some particular very experienced academics in this field, Flowerdew and Richardson, talk about language always doing something. It's always an active thing. It's never a passive. And you can't really understand what it's doing if you don't also question the discourses from which it comes. So one feature of critical discourse analysis is to uncover hidden features of language use in an effort to establish power relationships and so on. And so I've noted here that texts are often considered sites of struggle over meaning, in which different discourses and ideologies are contending for dominance. And CDA often includes an interest in how identity is formed through discourse. And it's really important to say that critical discourse analysis is an activist research agenda. It is explicitly promoted and used as a means of exposing social inequalities and some of the underlying elements of social inequalities. It is not a neutral research agenda. And I think if you're talking about critical discourse analysis, you need to be aware of that and in many cases to set it out explicitly in what you're writing. So the discourse in critical discourse analysis and CDS, I've basically already said this. Discourses are underpinned by ideologies, which are sets of beliefs and values belonging to particular social groups. An ideology may be disseminated to promote the interests of specific social groups. It may involve an us versus them situation, positive in-group and negative out-group representations. And you see exactly the same language being used in counter-narrative study. Now, at underpinning critical discourse analysis is the concept of social constructionism. And again, as I've said, I was not somebody, I have always struggled with the kind of ontological and epistemological paradigms underpinning work and found it very, very difficult to get my head around different ways of thinking about external realities and so on. But when I came across social constructionism again, suddenly something really made sense to me. And social constructionism is the idea that the social world is constructed through interaction. We produce and reproduce social phenomena, including our identities, through our social interactions. So ideas like disability aren't necessarily pre-existing things. They don't just exist, but they are socially constructed through our interactions, our social interactions. And language has an absolutely critical role in this. How we talk about things like disability creates and dictates elements of how those things are. So essentially at base, social constructionism is saying that language doesn't just reflect an external world. or a pre-existing social reality, but itself part of what creates that world. It's part of what creates our knowledge and the incidents and the things that we experience. It's absolutely fundamental to discourse analysis and critical discourse analysis. And I don't mean to say that there are no facts at all, that there is no pre-existing social reality. I mean to say that that our interreactions are hugely constitutive in those social realities. Different people and different researchers take this to different levels. Some are more kind of purist, for want of a better word, than others. The idea is generally moderated somewhat in critical discourse analysis, where researchers are more willing to accept that there are kind of external social realities than discourse analysis, where it tends to be a more fundamental approach. Obviously, that's a contested idea. I've met linguists and I've read linguists, including very prominent linguists, who just say, no, that's rubbish. Language is not a shaper of thought. It is something we use to express our thoughts. But to me, it made complete sense to me. And I think you either kind of have that sense or you don't. And if you don't have that sense at some level, critical discourse analysis probably isn't the tool for you, because it's so fundamental to the concepts. So moving on, critical discourse analysis is an approach. It is not a method. And this took me ages to get a handle on, because I was kind of walking about thinking, how do I do a critical discourse analysis? And I couldn't work out why there wasn't basically a manual, a book that I could get in the library saying critical discourse analysis, a manual. There is no toolkit. There is no textbook that tells you how to do critical discourse analysis. And I spent months kind of searching for one. Researchers do many different things using different methods. What is common to critical discourse analysis is this set of principles that I've just been discussing. So I came across studies doing loads and loads and loads of different things. It's fascinating, actually. There were some that were using linguistic approaches with very, very intricate studies of grammar and the structure of how language was being used. I came across studies of language in their context, study of rhetoric, coding of texts to see what came out of them, exploration of ideas. And I came across combinations of qualitative and quantitative approaches. So it's not a one kind of method. Examples of data that people use in CDA include things like policy documents, television programs, film, journalism, media reports, mass media, social media, computer software, etc., etc. So it's a much broader concept than just one kind of method. So just to tell you what I did, I've told you about my research project. Just a reminder, I was trying to get to the bottom of how independent living was constructed in different sets of texts and whether those constructions were similar or different. So methods. An overview of the methods. I'm going to give you an overview now, and then I'm going to go through each kind of part of the method in turn. Sorry, I've got a cold, so I do keep blowing my nose. I'm not going to go through the results in detail, by the way. I was given a brief that said focus on the methods, not the results. So I'm focusing on the methods. Essentially, I put together 3 different data sets. They were documents from what I described as the Anglo-British disabled people's movement. That was the disabled people's movement across the UK as a whole. including England, Wales, and Scotland, Northern Ireland, and so on. I also put together a database of the Welsh disabled people's movement because I wanted to see if there were differences in the construction of independent living and the interpretation of independent living in Wales specifically, because I was focusing on Welsh policy and law, as I said earlier. And then I compiled a database of policy documents from the Welsh government, which focused on social care and disability, and or both. And there were three basic structures or sections to the research. I read the texts, I coded the texts, and then I analysed the narrative elements within those texts. And I followed that. I beg your pardon, sorry. Every time I touch my mouse, I move the slides on. Don't mean to be doing that. I complemented that with what I called a doctrinal analysis of the Social Services and Wellbeing Wales Act 2014. By a doctrinal analysis, I mean an analysis of what the law does in practice, how the law plays out, how you can use the law as a social care user. The data sets. Sorry, I think I've skipped a slide there. If anybody's confused, just put your hand up and let me know. So my key question was, how were the disabled people's movement and policymakers constructing the concept of independent living in these different data sets? Where were the differences and what were the reasons for those differences and the implications of them? So essentially, I was looking for a method that was enabling me to establish the constructions of independent living in these three different sets of documents. So what I was trying to do was establish first what the ideas were within independent living. I wanted to establish the building blocks of independent living as constructed by disabled narratives, how those activists were using these ideas to create a counter-narrative and what that counter-narrative was doing, and how these different building blocks were performing the roles of resistance, and how they were performing the idea of identity repair. I then wanted to trace those same ideas into the policy and the legal documents to find out whether they were still present, and if so, whether they were constructed in the same way or whether they were different. And that would give me an overall detailed analysis of the meaning of independent living in different groups of documents, and kind of a solid understanding of the overall constructions of independent living in its original formation and in policy. And I drew particularly on research projects using critical discourse analysis and using coding methods. The reason for using the coding methods was that it struck me there as being particularly rigorous and particularly transparent in what I was doing. So I established my three different data sets. And then, as I say, I had these three different stages: reading the text, coding independent living within the texts, and the analysis of the kind of narrative elements that I established. And I was trying to get at, were different understandings there? And if so, were they accidental or intentional? What was happening and how was it happening, and the implications for the different groups? So in terms of the data sets, just a quick word on data sets. Obviously, the data set you use or the data sets you use are absolutely pivotal, because the documents that you include in your data set are the single most significant thing that will impact on the results you get. Yeah. And it's often a criticism of methods using textual analysis, particularly critical discourse analysis, that data selection can be biased and that researchers can cherry pick their data. So before I set out my data collection for each of the different data sets, I set out very, very clear boundaries of what I could and could not include in those data sets. And I included things, documents in those data sets strictly according to those criteria. I did not deviate from them. And they included matters such as access to them, who could access them, the authorship, the time span of the documents, the types of documents, the subject matter of the documents, and so on. And I set those out very, very clearly in my thesis. Reading the texts. I read these texts again and again and again and again and again. And I can tell you that when it comes to reading policy documents multiple times, it is really, really hard work because they're written in such a curious style. I read each document and reread each document, firstly in date order, and then I went backwards and forwards between them. Oh, and each of these stages was applied to each of the data sets in turn. And the first thing I did was just make notes on my immediate impressions, first in general, and then in relation to the conceptualization of independent living. And I set those notes aside then as a kind of repository of my original thoughts. I felt it was really important to have that, because when you're studying documents and really, really looking at them endlessly, you can lose sense in a curious kind of way of what they say, if that makes any sense. So I read them. And then I got starting on coding the texts. I imported the documents into NVivo, and then I reread them. And as I was rereading them, I identified every reference to independent living. And I coded every reference, or not just the reference, but the extract in which the concept of independent living appeared. And every code represented a kind of building block of independent living. Part of what independent living meant. And this included things like what independent living meant for disabled people, like the everyday, what it meant in an everyday life for disabled people. So things like choice, self-determination, freedom, having a fulfilling life, those kinds of things. They covered things like the enablers of independent living. How were disabled people achieving independent living? And what was necessary for disabled people to achieve independent living. But they also covered things like the history of independent living, the concept of independent living as a challenge or as a resistant, threats to independent living as the basis of a global movement, etc., etc. I wound up in total with 81 codes. Parent codes, and then child and grandchild nodes. Altogether, I had 81 codes. So it was a really exhaustive study of independent living. All of those codes were devised inductively. They came out of the text. And the extracts are multiple coded. I applied as many codes to any single extract as I needed. And I developed the coding structure first through the work on the Anglo-British DPM data set, because that was where the concept of independent living in the UK was originally devised and set out. And then I applied those codes to the other data sets. And sometimes, obviously, codes disappeared and other codes came in and were added. And then I analysed the coded extracts. As I said, there were 81 codes. I couldn't possibly analyse all 81 codes. I selected the codes that related to the identity and agency of disabled people, because those were the elements that related specifically to the matter of identity construction and counter-narrative. They were kind of essential to the concept of identity repair. I paid attention to the number of references in each code, because I thought that was important as a general indicator of their prominence and potentially of their importance. But I didn't place any importance on that beyond that, because I felt that there were so many different things which dictate how often something is referred to, that putting an enormous significance on it struck me as being potentially problematic. And overall, I felt that actually the consistency of references, how many times building blocks or themes appeared across the text within a data set, was as important as how many times they appeared. And then I explored the content of each building block. For example, choice. How was choice expressed? Was it expressed as a positive or as a negative, as a denial of choice? Was it a choice between things, a free choice, a fundamental idea or an incidental idea? Was it an abstract concept? Were people just talking about choice? Or were they talking about very specific forms of choice, choice over this or choice over that? Was it always expressed the same way within a data set? Or was there kind of a development in a theme? So I did a certain amount of exploring the evolution of the building blocks or the themes. There was a limited amount that I could do with that, and I was very open about that, but I did as much as I could. And of course, I thought about what remains unsaid in the text. Where were there silences in the text? Because silence in the text tells you as much as what is being said very often. So then I was able to compare how these building blocks themselves were constructed in the different data sets. And I was able to trace them backwards and forwards through the different data sets. So I was able to look at, for each of these themes or building blocks, was the construction the same, or were different ideas connected to the building blocks and to independent living in the different data sets? If the same building blocks appeared, were they constructed in the same way? And if not, how were they different? So that enabled me first to look at how independent living performed the role of identity repair. And then I was able to look at, in Wales, did the disabled people's movement use it in precisely the same way to construct the same repair? And then I was able to look at, in the Welsh Government policy documents, did they construct independent living in the same way? And did those documents support the repaired identity that disabled activists had constructed? And did this counter-narrative of resistance remain the same in the policy context? And if not, what was it achieving? What was the concept of independent living achieving in the policy context? So that was the basis of my analysis. I can see I'm running out of time, so I'll move swiftly on. Benefits and limitations. There were, sorry, that's a tiny writing on that slide, isn't it? My apologies for that. There were various benefits to the methods that I selected, but there were limitations as well. And for me as well, it was really important to be upfront about both. The benefits were, this gave me a really highly systemic analysis of the construction of independent living. The analysis was replicable across the different data sets. It enabled me to trace ideas and to make valid comparisons about the construction of this subject in the different data sets. So I was able to study specifically the construction of independent living as a counter-narrative, and it was transparent. It was really transparent. Anybody reading my thesis can see exactly what I've done, and all the codes and all the information is presented in the thesis in the appendices. There were some very significant limitations. The most significant limitation by some way to me was that the most detailed analysis was conducted on small sections of text. I balanced that by going back, and once I'd identified the building blocks of independent living as attached to independent living, I did then explore all of those concepts in the wider texts as well. When I reported on the findings, I always made it very, very clear whether I was talking about the extracts or whether I was talking about the broader texts. I also referred back to my original notes, my kind of note repository of when I was, from when I first read the texts. I also felt that that limitation was less of an issue because I was always upfront that what I was examining was the construction of independent living within the texts. You know, but I was very clear about the difficulties and the limitations of the method. I'll talk about some findings very, very briefly. The construction of independent living between the UK disabled people's movement and the Welsh disabled people's movement, they were not unsurprisingly very similar. Sorry, not surprisingly very similar. The construction of independent living in the policy documents was also quite similar in that the same building blocks appeared. But the similarity was very, very superficial. So independent living looked the same on a casual reading of the texts. But on a deeper reading of the texts and on analysis of these ideas that were attached to independent living, there were some very significant differences. Now, it was absolutely clear in the policy documents that there were efforts to construct new narratives around disabled people. Independent living was used as a way of expressing those new narratives of people being able to live equal lives. But those attempts were undermined by both intentional and unintentional alterations to the construction of independent living. And the fact that independent living was constructed very differently in the policy documents was expected, but how it happened wasn't necessarily expected. The headline finding, put very coarsely, was that where the state wasn't significantly involved in the interaction with disabled people, the repaired narratives around disabled people were quite prominent. So, for example, where policy was talking about things like access to shops and facilities and employment and education, these repaired narratives of equality and activity and agency were quite prominent. But where the state was involved, particularly in relation to social care, the original narratives of disabled people re-emerged. And we started to slip back to narratives of passivity and inability and deficit and lack of ambition. And that occurred, again, very, very briefly, very coarsely, through the modification of certain key concepts. So these concepts appeared in very compromised forms. Choice didn't appear in a sense of kind of free choice. It appeared as a very narrow choice over certain things, typically. Other concepts were produced in an incredibly vague structure. When you tried to pin down what they actually were, the words were being used, but when you tried to pin down what those words actually meant, it was very, very difficult to actually get a handle on them. Some ideas were particularly connected to kind of administrative ideas rather than disabled people's lives. So the result was that essentially traditional narratives around disabled people of passivity and deficiency were really, really overtly challenged. Not in all documents, but in some of them. But covertly, when you look through them, they were quite strongly reinforced. And the concept of independent living as a challenge to establish master narratives just kind of fell by the wayside. Now, I've given a very, very potted kind of results there. My kind of end point really is, if you're interested in critical discourse analysis or critical discourse studies, or you have an interest in it, do just dive in, read about it, give it a go. I think you can be inspired by it and you can draw on it. I'm not convinced you need to go through this really quite traumatic gripping certain specific methods that are attached to very strongly abstract concepts. I think this is something that you can use without being torn apart by it, and with also acknowledging your struggles with it, and being transparent about how your work is connecting to critical discourse analysis and how it isn't. And that's really where I am. I put in not just references at the end, but some further reading, some books and papers and things that I found useful when I started getting going on this, this piece of research.